I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, and I really want to thank the Center for Humanities and the Nachbahr Committee for giving me the Nachbahr Award for this year. And I'm especially thrilled to be presenting today and sharing the stage with two former students, Hunter and Matt, and it's just really great to hear about their work. I've not taught Matt since sophomore year, and it's just great to see how they've flowered. And I think all three of you have just bright futures. So I hope you'll continue to share your scholarship and share your knowledge with all of us. We all need more knowledge, right? I also want to thank the colleagues and students, former students, parents, administrators, and staff who are all here today for your support. And I also want to thank you for your curiosity, just to find out more about what kinds of research and scholarship are being done here at Loyola. And I especially want to thank the people who are here but who have already heard a lot about my work. I work with a great group of people here at Loyola, over cups of coffee, over computer screens in the library, over drafts, and sometimes over beer. So you all know who you are, so I really thank you for all your support over the years. Diving into the wreck, I've taken, or really stolen, the title of my talk from a poem by Adrienne Rich. I chose this poem because it depicts, in a singularly evocative way, what it means to be a scholar of literary and artistic productions that some charitably describe as understudied, that others less charitably describe as forgotten, and that some do not see as either literary or artistic in any way. You could say that I study the wrecks of culture. And what I will talk about today is what about it means to dive into these wrecks. What does one find? What can one learn or know? And finally, why do it at all? So I'm actually going to be kind of talking about a lot of the works that Dr. Osteen mentioned in his introduction. So you'll get a little bit of a sense of what each of these things is and how it has contributed to my career. I'll also be kind of referring to Rich's poem from time to time. So if you're not familiar with the poem, it will be the slides where there's italic. Rich begins her poem with an evocative scene of preparation. First, having read the book of myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. I am having to do this, not like Cousteau with his assiduous team aboard the sun-flooded schooner, but here alone. When most people think of English professors, an image comes to mind. For many, it's Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society. Who are English professors? Those who study poetry, beauty, romance, love. It's these things, he says, that we stay alive for. It's these things we share with our students. My own experience with literature has been a bit different. Yes, poetry, beauty, romance, love, they were all there. But there were other things also. Ugly things, like the portrayal of the gullible, helpless Jim in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a character I was told to celebrate as Huck's only friend. The venal, blasé vapidity of Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. She resembled no girl I'd ever known. The more I read, the more ugly literature became for me. Mowgli's, Butterflies, Tarzans, Charlie Chan's, Uncle Tom's, fallen women, invisible men, tragic mulattoes. I found myself drawn to characters like Lady Macbeth and Ophelia, but hating how their stories ended. In college, I wrote a paper arguing that Satan was the real hero of Paradise Lost. I wondered why so few of the books I was assigned to read were by people like me. What I was reading, I learned later in graduate school, was the Book of Myths. What I gained in my discomfort, questioning, and occasional rage was both knife blade and body armor, absurd flippers, a grave and awkward mask. The first wreck I chose to study in graduate school initially attracted me with its beauty. It was obvious why Onoto Watana, whose real name was Winifred Eaton, was such a popular author during the early years of the 20th century. Her books were, and still are, treasures. But the words within are difficult to read. They're written in a tortured, pseudo-Japanese dialect, and Watana's plots initially seem to merely ape that of John Luther Long's Madame Butterfly, a much familiar story to many of you, whose heroine Cho-Cho-san kills herself out of love for the dashing but faithless Navy Lieutenant B.F. Pinkerton. Not only that, Winifred Eaton was merely pretending to be Japanese. She was a half Chinese, half English Canadian, but adopted a Japanese-sounding pseudonym. She did not speak any Japanese. She wore kimonos in public. It seemed obvious enough that she was capitalizing on the American craze for Japanese culture, inspired by the Japanese pavilion installed at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Her apparent betrayal of her Chinese side was underscored by the fact that her older sister, Edith, writing under the more legit pseudonym Suisun Far, had already paved the way for sympathetic portrayals of people of Chinese descent in the United States and in Canada. It's easy to see why Onoto Watana was forgotten, not only by American literary historians, but also by Asian American historians who championed the work of Edith as foundational to the development of Asian American literature, and denigrated Winifred's romances as assimilationist commercial kitsch. I wondered what would drive a writer to so willfully capitalize on stereotypes, to write, one might say, at her own expense. So I dove into the wreck. I read her works. She wrote a lot, a dozen or so novels, dozens and dozens of short stories, many of which I tracked down by paging through dusty old magazines and scrolling through endless reels of microfilm. Many of the stories I discovered had been lost, never published in book form, and seemingly discarded once the issue of the magazine in which it appeared had been read, or when the next issue arrived. It was a big pile of literary wreckage. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. This is the place. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. The more I looked, the more I became convinced that Winifred Eaton was actually a much more subversive writer than she appeared, one who challenged the very stereotypes she appeared to emulate. Her Asian, female, and indigenous characters spoke in unwieldy, ugly forms, but I learned that what they had to say would not fit in the literary boxes that were available to them. Here, for example, are the final lines of Eaton's early story, A Half-Caste, where the heroine, Kiku, works as a geisha in a tawdry tea house. She's a mixed-race curiosity provided for the enjoyment, the titillation of the male clientele. She attracts the attention of a handsome American businessman named Hilton. This plot sounds familiar. She eventually discovers to her great horror that he is, in fact, her father who had abandoned her mother, a la B.F. Pinkerton, years ago. And so she decides she's going to try to seduce him. Just as Hilton believes he is about to succeed in getting her to run off with him, she confronts him with the embodied legacy of an American tradition of careless seduction and betrayal. So I'll let you read this passage for yourselves. I don't really want to read it out loud. American literary historian Patricia Wald has written that a characteristic element of American literature is what she calls the untold story. This is the story that writers feel compelled to tell because it has never been told before. Wald writes that those who choose to tell these previously untold stories must choose between conforming to cultural prescriptions and refusing comprehensibility altogether. These are the stories that interest me, these wrecks of incomprehensibility, abandoned and forgotten because they are not immediately understood. What I do is engage in acts of literary recovery. Some of the wrecks have to be reassembled out of parts, literally taped together. Others were abandoned half-finished or have decayed to the point where not only are they incomprehensible, I can't even read my prose, they are also illegible. But if they are ever to be understood, they must be dusted off, repaired, recollected, which is to say, collected again and remembered. And they also have to be made comprehensible, especially for a present-day audience. One thing that I find endlessly fascinating is how quickly literary texts become incomprehensible, especially when they are directly responding to their present moment. Their very topicality gave them widespread appeal during their day. Winifred Eaton's works, for example, were read by hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of readers. But writers like Eaton are also the losers in battles of representation. If they have been passed by, superseded, or even actively suppressed, it is because they became unfashionable or pointed out uncomfortable realities or deviated, as Wald wrote, from convention. So with the plays of Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston, which I edited with my then Loyola colleague Charlie Mitchell, much of the work we undertook was in putting Hurston's dialect-based dramatic works, avoided with something akin to embarrassment by civil rights-era African-American literary historians, into an ethnographic and popular context. We traced references to songs and folktales to their originals, or some version of their originals, Bob, and showed how they undergirded the play's plots and climactic scenes. We connected scenes and set pieces from the plays to Hurston's better-known works, such as Their Eyes Were Watching God. We placed her plays within a broader trajectory of Black theater and the development of the Broadway musical. In my work on Henry McNeill Turner's Civil War newspaper columns that were devoured by Black readers across the nation during the war, I argued that Turner represents an important assertion of 19th century free Black selfhood, rooted in Black oral and sermonic traditions. This form of selfhood sits uncomfortably with the traditions of the slave narrative, stories of passing, and tragic mulatto tales that make up the bulk of what was, and to a great extent still is, recognized as 19th century African American literature. Long before Malcolm X, decades before Marcus Garvey, Turner asserted Black self-sufficiency and the need for Black-led political organizations and protest, positions that many, even today, find difficult to countenance. Telling these stories has not always been easy. It is easy to forget what I came for, among so many who have always lived here. The thing I came for, the wreck, and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself, and not the myth. As you can see with the examples of Eaton, Hurston, and Turner, Much of the literature I study has been abandoned not just by the so-called establishment or the mainstream, but even by those attempting to establish alternate histories of American literature. It's important, I think, to question the myths that are handed down to us, no matter where they come from. We must confront the thing itself and not the myth. My most recent project has taken me to things that many do not consider literature or even artistic at all. These are the things no one wants to claim, the wrecks of culture so horrifying, so troubling, I guess charming for some, so honestly humiliating, that even I sometimes wonder if they are best left at the bottom of the historical ocean. I'm in the final stages of a book titled How the Other Half Laughs, The Comic Sensibility in American Culture. In it, I examined the effect of the early newspaper comic strip on art and literature in the early 20th century. These early comic strips were crudely drawn. They traffic in the most offensive racial and ethnic stereotyping. They are filled with slang, with grotesque depictions of children, animals, even Santa Claus, engaging in violent and sometimes sexual acts. They follow the rhythms and repeat the jokes of blackface minstrelsy and variety theater. Although they evolved into the innocuous comic strips we associate with the Sunday funny pages, on their initial appearance, they were considered tasteless at best, often profane. Cultural commentators saw them as a sign of the end of American civilization, the triumph of what George Orwell would later dub the proles. I argue that these comic strips, in fact, liberated American art. Like Dada, Surrealism, and other proto-modernist movements, comic culture indulged in the irrational and the grotesque to create new forms of representation. They demonstrate that immigrant and working class life was not solely concerned with sorrow, oppression, and poverty. It was capable of imagination and wit. As Scott Buchatman has written, cultural forms such as the comic strip provided ways for readers to engage the illogics that allow us to escape the rigors of structured time and established habits of mind. The wrecks of culture hold a strange fascination for me, but I hope I've shown that my interest in them is not driven by morbid curiosity. By locating and excavating these wrecks and bringing them back to the surface of history, we can bring them back to life and perhaps inspire new life in those who have found the book of myths to be wanting. Like Rich, I've found that I started my work feeling quite alone, quite unlike Jacques Cousteau and his assiduous crew. But I've come to realize over the years that scholarship is not best done in solitude. Scholarship is not just dialectic, confrontation, competition, but it comes out of collaboration and mutuality also. I discovered that I'm part of a great collective of scholars working together to deepen and broaden our understanding of culture, what it is, what it was, and what it can be. I've co-edited most of the volumes I've edited. I co-edit a journal now. I like to work with students on research projects. As Dr. Osteen mentioned, I'm currently working with Hunter. Maybe I'll draw you guys into a new project, researching female readers and writers in Baltimore during the early 20th century. My thinking and my writing is strengthened and buoyed by the contributions of many others. So, what does one find when one goes diving into wrecks, when one engages in these acts of literary or cultural recovery? One finds those who have been lost, those who have been dispossessed, those who have been forgotten. What does one learn? That the wrecks have meaning and contain their own beauty, that there's more truth in the world than we thought we knew, that salvaging the wrecks can show us how to be more human, that many of us together are required to do this work. In that light, I'll close, as I began, with the words of Rich. She writes, "We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to the scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear." Thank you.
In previous years, the Nachbahr address was given at the honors convocation, and there were no questions asked. But we're happy to open it for questions or comments if anyone would like to ask Dr. Cole something or make a comment or ask for clarification. Are you all very hungry? Yeah, go ahead.
I am hungry, sorry. It's very short.
Sure.
Have you seen if the books have led to scholarship, like renewed attention?
So glad you asked that question. So one of the things about doing this kind of work is that, as my colleagues in the room know, it's often counted for less in terms of scholarship than monographs or book or articles, journal articles. And part of the reason is because it's very difficult to show impact for editions. And there have been some recent analyses of scholarly of impact of these recovery editions, and the agreement seems to be that it takes about 30 years for a new edition of a work to actually have a significant effect in the classroom or in scholarship. So, I can say that the Winifred Eaton Japanese Nightingale edition I can see is just starting to be picked up in some undergraduate and graduate classes now. The Hurston plays, I'm still waiting. That came out in 2008. I would love to see people perform those plays more. Part of the reason why Charlie and I co-edited them was to bring them back onto the stage. So we have a lot of footnoting to explain how to stage these plays. And I haven't seen a whole lot with that yet. But, in a way, being told that it would take 30 years, it's like I can wait. Yes?
Any thoughts on the role that comics play in the development of people's opinions?
Just opinions generally?
Well, have you ever thought about developing your own a comic book that would influence people in the right way?
Well, I'm not really... Actually, I did a comic strip when I was in high school for my school newspaper. I had kind of forgotten about this until I started working on this book, and then I remembered, oh my God, I have all these comic strips. So that would be interesting. But I think there are actually a lot of graphic novelists now who are trying to retell these stories in graphic form. One that I think is really striking is Incognito, which is about William White, a civil rights activist, a story that has not been really fully fleshed out. I think even Persepolis, which is a book that many of you are probably familiar with, tells a story about the relationship between Iran and the United States that has gotten less attention. And that's a book that is all over the place now in high schools and in colleges. Yes, I think that, we tend to denigrate contemporary culture for being too image-driven, but I think it also can be a powerful tool to change people's minds and attitudes. But,
thank you, Gina. It was really wonderful. At the very beginning, when you said, to sort of conclude, so what do we find when we dive back into the racks? I actually thought you were going to say something different.
Oh. What should I have said?
What you said goes along really nicely with the end of the poem. Right at the very end of it, we find a book of myths in which our names do not appear. And we said we find what's been excluded, what's been marginally left out. But I actually thought what you were going to say is if we find, or we have this book of myths in which our names do appear, but appear in distorted forms. Right? So that what you find in the record is kind of the history, kind of like an archaeology of the formation of prejudice.
Yeah, or a book of myths in which our names were erased, or the traces where they appeared.
So I understand that part about the forgotten, but a lot of what I heard you talking about was stuff that's living on, but living for the distortions of a certain,
Yeah, I mean,
whether it's modern butterfly character.
yeah, I mean, I think the question that was asked of Matt on, on Sepolia, I was really struck because I think it's a two-way movement, right? I mean, we recover these texts that were forgotten, but when we bring them back, we have to look at the texts that we remember in a different way, right? I mean, the whole fabric gets transformed. So, I consider all of this part of American literature. I don't like calling it immigrant literature, African American literature, or whatever, because to me, what's interesting is when you look at these texts, it makes you see modernism, for example, in a different way, or it makes you see 19th century American literature in a different way, or the slave narrative in a different way. So, yeah, I think it's kind of bouncing back and forth between the two. So, thanks for that.
Thanks very much. Let's eat.
Yes.
Nice job.